Today we're going to look at the Reagan administration, at least Mr. Reagan's first term as President of the United States. When Ronald Reagan ran for president, he pledged to the American people that he was going to cut taxes. At the same time, he talked about limiting government spending. That would be mostly on social programs, but he wanted to increase spending on the military. The idea of fewer taxes but greater spending is referred to as supply-side economics by those who have studied economics. For those of you who see yourself as members of the Republican Party, this pretty much is the foundation of the Republican Party today. Most people simply refer to supply-side economics as Reaganomics.
Reaganomics refers to the economic policies of Ronald Reagan, the 40th President of the United States of America. We're going to take a look at the economic policy that still affects your paycheck to this day. When Ronald Reagan was elected to be the 40th President of the United States in 1980, the nation's economy had been in a state of great inflation since 1965. The decade leading up to Reagan's presidency was characterized by something called stagflation, where prices were rising even as unemployment remained high and economic growth was slow or stalled. This not only damaged the U.S. economy, but economies around the world. Reagan's solution was an economic plan that became to be known by his supporters and critics alike as Reaganomics. Reaganomics was heavily based on the trickle-down theory. This argues that if you lower costs for corporations by cutting their taxes, businesses use those savings to invest. The thinking was more money for corporations would mean more jobs and higher wages for workers and thus increased spending. But trickle-down is a controversial idea. Opponents argue that when corporate taxes are cut, domestic social programs suffer. And most likely only a small handful of rich individuals at the top become even richer. Reaganomics wasn't just about tax cuts. The policy had three other central points: deregulating businesses, turning government services over to private contractors, and decreasing spending on domestic social programs, including food stamps, Social Security, and disability insurance. During his presidency, Reagan signed two tax bills into law, one in 1981 and the other in 1986. As a combined result of the 1981 and 1986 bills, the top income tax rate was slashed from 70% to 28%, the lowest income tax rates for the rich since the 1920s. Reagan's policies were highly debated, and economists still argue about the pros and cons of Reaganomics in terms of both immediate and lasting effects. Proponents argue that by 1983, the nation's economy had started to recover from stagflation. This led to a period of economic prosperity that continued through the rest of Reagan's presidency, though another recession soon followed after he left office. But critics argue that based on a normal economic cycle, the economy would have recovered from the recession on its own without Reaganomics. Critics also point out that Reaganomics led to larger, not smaller, budget deficits and a larger national debt. Many people say Reagan giving corporate tax cuts while cutting funding for domestic social programs was a policy that favored the rich and led to increased wealth inequality. While Republicans tend to reference Reaganomics as exemplary policies, Democrats almost always bring it up as an example of corporate greed that hurts the middle and working classes. Either way, it remains a defining part of Ronald Reagan's presidency and legacy.
Well, Reagan was opposed to government interference, and he began a tactic of deregulation. The idea by Mr. Reagan and his administration was he wanted to take the federal government out of our very lives. Now, Congress, which was heavily Democratic, disagreed. and the states would still have to carry out these federal programs. But they were told that they would have to cover the expense. So let's look at the state of Missouri. The state of Missouri's budget increased dramatically during the Reagan years. We had to carry out all of the federal programs begun by the Great Society, but now it was Missouri who had to pay for them, not the federal government. The Fed, the Federal Institute, the people who print our money, disagreed with Reagan and how he wanted to do things. And the Fed decided that instead of Reaganomics, they would practice high interest rates. So interest rates, which today are practically at 1 or 2%, were in the high teens during the Reagan years. Well, people had money to spend because they didn't have to spend as much in income tax. But with the rates so high for interest, it kind of wiped everything out. Reagan proposed a tougher dealing with the Soviet Union. Now, he knew that the Soviets had trouble spending for defense. Their economy was not as secure as ours. The United States had pretty much the same number of ships as the Russians. We had about the same size of army as the Soviets. Same Air Force. What we were concerned about, though, was Soviet missiles. We believed that a few Soviet missiles fired at us could do unbelievable harm to this country. Reagan proposed that we use lasers. He proposed that lasers be put on satellites, lasers be put on airplanes, lasers be put on the ground. And as the Soviet missiles began to lift off, our various laser craft would destroy the Soviet missiles before they would ever impact on us. Now, Reagan referred to this as the Missile Defense Program or Strategic Program. Most people simply referred to it by a popular movie of the day, Star Wars.
I call upon the scientific community, those who gave us nuclear weapons, to turn their great talents now to the cause of mankind and world peace, to give us the means of rendering these nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete.
The President's call for a defense system would prove to be one of the most controversial decisions of the arms race. The President's proposal was startling, to move beyond the suicidal terms of mutual assured destruction by erecting a defensive fortress in space. Many Americans, weary of living in the shadow of possible nuclear attack, responded to the idea. But others fear Star Wars is an unworkable and dangerous delusion, that while the proposal seems visionary, it repeats a 40-year pattern that has entrapped every president, liberal and conservative. Failing to break through the deepest political tensions propelling the arms race, each has sought a technological deliverance from a threat created by earlier technologies, has sought security in new scientific advantage. Here, an artist's projection of the President's vision.
Landing into space, a layered defense to protect the country from nuclear devastation. U.S. spy satellites would watch the world below, detect Soviet missiles blasting off, compute the position and speed of each missile, alert battle stations in space, on Earth. The first response: space-based kinetic energy weapons fire high-speed projectiles from hypervelocity guns, intercepting enemy missiles as they are boosted through the atmosphere. Popped up into space, Earth-based nuclear-powered X-ray lasers fire their radioactive rays. Attack rays from land-based excimer lasers are redirected by huge mirrors orbiting in space. Chemical lasers fire beams that burn through the shell of the onrushing missile. Particle beam weapons with pulsing rays join the attack. Still over the atmosphere, the missile bus ejects its cargo. multiple nuclear warheads. As the remaining Soviet missiles now arc towards the U.S., ground-based projectiles are volleyed into space. Their giant steel ribs shatter the enemy weapons. The final minute. The surviving warheads enter the atmosphere above the United States, are attacked by laser-equipped planes. Earth-based lasers and ABM rockets eliminate the last warheads.
The administration's original claim for the Strategic Defense Initiative was that it would be a perfect defense. The president's
Now, of course, the Star Wars plan would cost tens of billions of dollars. This would increase the budget of the United States even farther. Lebanon had been going through a civil war soon after the Yom Kippur War of 1973 was over. There are people in Lebanon who support Israel. There are people in Lebanon who support Syria. These two groups began to battle with each other. The United Nations called in a peacekeeping force, and the United States said that it would send in U.S. Marines. Well, as in any civil war, eventually you have to take sides. If you take the sides of one, then you anger the sides of the other. And the United States will take the side of the Lebanese who are supported by Israel. Syrian Lebanese will decide to launch a terrorist act on the U.S. Marines in Beirut. This is one of the costliest terrorist acts in the history of the United States. The Americans would withdraw from Lebanon soon after, and the civil war would continue for another 10 years.
October 23rd, 1983. Ring any bells? For the majority of you, probably not. You'll probably remember December 7th, 1941, or September 11th, 2001. However, October 23rd, 1983 is just as significant in our country's history, as well as our cores. Many argue it's the day the War on Terror truly began. It was a Sunday morning, and just like many Sundays, the Marines were enjoying a couple extra hours of sleep during their deployment to Beirut, Lebanon. Dave Medeiros was a private first class who had just finished up his motor transport course. His final test was scheduled for Monday.
I woke up at 6 a.m. on Sunday morning, and we were in a GP tent sleeping on cots, and I looked around, and I was like, man, all these guys are still sleeping. And probably for one of the first times in my life, I chose to go back to sleep versus eat, which is a rare occasion. I don't do that often.
HM3 Mark Hakala was serving as a platoon hospital corpsman with Bravo Company, positioned on the southern end of the airport.
I hadn't been to sleep for terribly long, and so I was pretty down and out.
Major Bob Jordan was the Marine spokesman for the 24th Marine Amphibious Unit. He was with his crew in these fire truck bays not far from the BLT headquarters.
About 6 o'clock, I woke up at my normal time. I could see the sun shining through the bullet holes in the corrugated door of the fire bay door where we slept. So I rolled away from the door and pulled my Snoopy blanket up over me to catch a few more winks.
Greetings to the families of Battalion Landing Team 1-8.
Lieutenant Colonel Larry Gerlach, the commanding officer of 1-8, was in the BLT headquarters. It was both his command post and his barracks. Around 6:20 a.m., everything changed. PFC Medeiros was no longer sleeping under a tent. Petty Officer Hakala and Major Jordan were now wide awake. Colonel Gerlach was no longer in the BLT building. What was the largest non-nuclear explosion on the planet had just wiped the building out. A 12,000-pound explosion that would ring for decades. America lost 241 Marines, sailors, and soldiers in the rubble that day. Terrorists finally landed a powerful hit.
That's their playbook. They built their playbook over time. I would call it like a cult who is following an ideology, and they're building their playbook based on how we respond to certain things. And I mean, they're taking notes.
When the Marines pulled out in 1984, Osama bin Laden and many others were watching. They had tested us militarily. They had tested us spiritually. They had tested us politically.
America's defensive playbook was rewritten, but the punches kept rolling. Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia, USS Cole in Yemen, 9/11.
The prevent defense prevents nothing. And if that's the posture we want to take in the United States, okay, I'd like to ask the people that think that way to come down to Jacksonville and stand there next to a mother who lost one of their kids in Beirut and explain to her how we should take a preventative posture.
An armed attack against the United States of America should.
With September 11th, the extremist agenda had an exclamation point, and the U.S. launched combat operations in what is now known as the Global War on Terror. But Beirut veterans say it should have been declared more than 2 decades ago, with an event that now simply hangs in the distant backdrop of time.
In the United States, a lot of times we fall asleep. They do something and they let it die out, and we're all excited about, the price of gasoline or whatever the topic of the day is. And we totally lose sight of an issue that really has a lot of substance to it.
I think many of us wonder, had we taken a firm stance and a firm response at that time, all these other attacks that took place in the coming decades, would they have been tried? Would they have been attempted?
All of the Beirut veterans we interviewed lived by a common motto: our first duty is to remember. Lieutenant Colonel Gerlach still remembers. He's still in a wheelchair because of it. He doesn't remember the blast itself. He attributes that lost memory to the large piece of concrete they had to remove from his head after he was blown out of the BLT building. But he remembers his fellow Marines and sailors from that day, and he says the fight is still on.
And I hate war. But by damn, if we don't take a stand, just imagine what would have happened in World War II and how that would have turned out in all the other wars that have gone on.
Major Jordan says victory is in the memories veterans leave behind.
There were sailors and Marines.
We stood against tyranny. We stood against terror. And we have to remember, make the people who wish us harm, they need to know that we were not defeated in Beirut. We're still here. And our sons and our daughters and our grandsons and our granddaughters will be told the story. And they will be here for generations in the future. And that's the hope of America.
They came in peace, and now they walk on peaceful shores.
1984 was a presidential election year. Now, normally, if you are the sitting president and you are running for re-election, this is your chance to say, look how good I have done. Your opponent says, look how bad you have done. In 1984, the Democrats are going to turn to Walter Mondale. Walter Mondale had been Jimmy Carter's vice president. To stir the pot a little bit, Walter Mondale suggests that Geraldine Ferraro, Congresswoman from New York, be his running mate, and the party agreed. So Geraldine Ferraro becomes the first woman to run for vice president for a major party. Obviously, the Republicans are going to choose Mr. Reagan. The red states are Mr. Reagan. The blue state is Mr. Mondale. What you are looking at is the greatest landslide victory by any American president who has been popularly elected. You can see that Reagan won all but one of the states. It is important that every year the president have a physical. And in 1985, soon after his inauguration, Mr. Reagan went in for a physical. During the physical, it was discovered that Mr. Reagan had cancer of the colon. He was operated on, but knowing that he would have to give up the presidency temporarily. This is the first time that that part of the 25th Amendment has ever been used. A week later, Mr. Reagan continued as president. In Central America, the Sandinistas were members of the Communist Party, and they were trying to take over the country of Nicaragua. The United States was opposed to this, and the United States was wanting to support the Contras. The problem is the Contras were making most of their money off of creating drugs that they sold to Americans. So Congress said no. Now, if any of you have the pre-printed slides, we're going to do a few changes in the next couple of ones. The CIA was brought in to sell weapons. Now, Iran had taken 7 American hostages during the Reagan administration. Iran said that they would sell the hostages for weapons. Remember, Iran used mostly American weapons because of the Shah. The United States agreed. Now, the sale was supposed to be for like $20 million. But as it turned out, the Americans actually had a little money left over. And so they gave this money to the Contras. Now, of course, this is in direct opposition to what Congress had said. Most of the money went to the Congress, and so Congress began an investigation. A lot of the ideas were supplied by this man, Oliver North. Now, Oliver North was what we would call the cutout man. He was the guy who took the American supplies and sold them to Iraq. He was the guy who took the money from the CIA and gave them to the Contras. Now the question is, how much did the president know about what was going on? Well, in the end, the commission that was created to investigate this said that most of the people in Reagan's administration knew what was going on, but Reagan himself was never implicated. He was just chastised as a poor manager for this affair.
It was one of America's most notorious presidential scandals that was cost Ronald Reagan his presidency. The Iran-Contra affair. In the early 1980s, the U.S. was still in a Cold War with Russia, and anti-communist sentiment was strong. During his presidential campaign, Reagan promised to assist anti-communist insurgencies around the world. For a brief time under Reagan, the CIA trained and assisted groups fighting communist leaders abroad. Reagan was particularly interested in a group called the Contras and their battle in Nicaragua. The Contras were a group battling the Cuban-backed Sandinistas, a communist group who had seized power in 1979. Reagan called the Contras the moral equivalent of our founding fathers. But much of the Contras' funding came from the cocaine trade. Because of this, Congress passed the Boland Amendment, specifically aimed at keeping American money from funding the group. That happened in 1982, shortly after Reagan took office. The amendment restricted the CIA and Department of Defense from using funds to provide military assistance to groups that were trying to overthrow Nicaragua's government, groups like the Contras. This didn't stop Reagan. The president told his national security advisor, Robert McFarlane, to help the Contras anyway, regardless of the cost. McFarlane found opportunity in Iran. In 1985, an Iranian-backed terrorist group held 7 American hostages in Lebanon. Reagan insisted his advisors find a way to bring the hostages home, saying, "I want you to do whatever you have to do to help these people keep body and soul together." So with permission from Reagan, McFarland made a deal. The U.S. would give Iran weapons, and Iran would broker the release of the hostages. This happened even though Reagan publicly insisted he would not negotiate with terrorists, and despite the fact that there was a trade embargo with Iran. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. The deal with Iran didn't just secretly secure the release of the hostages in exchange for weapons, and there was money involved. While $30 million had been allocated for the weapons, the CIA funneled a portion of that money to the Contras in Nicaragua, the group Reagan supported in their guerrilla fight against the Sandinista government. In 1986, the Lebanese newspaper Al Shura reported the arms deal, and everything began to unravel. That prompted an investigation by the U.S. Attorney General, who discovered that only $12 million of the $30 million actually went toward weapons for Iran. The rest of the money was sent to the Contras in Nicaragua. The revelations were explosive. Reagan denied the allegations that he had negotiated with terrorists, but Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North came forward and acknowledged that he diverted funds to the Contras. North also said Reagan knew about it. North's testimony would inspire the press and Congress to launch investigations against Reagan for the rest of his presidency. Texas Senator John Tower led the investigation into the scandal. The Tower Commission determined it was Reagan's lack of oversight that allowed Iran-Contra to happen, but did not implicate Reagan directly. It wasn't until another congressional investigation in 1987 that Reagan finally testified. On May 5, 1987, joint hearings were televised investigating the covert arms deal with Iran and the assistance to Nicaragua. The hearings would go on for 41 days. Reagan was never charged, but McFarland, Oliver North, 4 CIA officers, 5 government contractors, and Reagan's national security advisor, John Poindexter, were all found guilty. Yet, speculation about Reagan's involvement lingered on. Press investigations would go on for years to follow. While Reagan's image suffered a bit, he still left office with one of the highest approval ratings of any president in U.S. history.
Well, we are finished with today's work. I would remind you that you have until 11:59 tonight to submit your answers. Good luck.